thanks everybody for coming, and thanks to the McGuire Center and to Rita for having me. It's a pleasure, and we're very lucky at SMU to have the McGuire Center. One of the points, actually, of this talk is that it's kind of crucial to have some places where you can debate and discuss ethics and come to find out the reasons for the ethical beliefs that you have, and not just sort of accept the beliefs that sort of get handed down to you or that get spit out of Google or what have you. So to kind of get the idea set up, what I have imagined is that there is an app called Google Morals. And this is a pretty familiar idea because we all have apps kind of like this on our phones. We have Google Maps, right? And that's how I found this place. I wasn't able to find the particular room. For that, I had to go to Candy. But for actually finding the building, I went to Google Maps, and that's how I get around. You can go to a city you've never been in and suddenly know where everything is. But and we don't think that there's any problem with that. In fact, we think it's great that you can do that. But if you imagine that we had an app that was Google Morals, and that instead of entering in a location that you wanted to get to, you had a moral dilemma, or you had some sort of a crossroads, an ethical crossroads, that you had to enter in. Should I eat this lunch that has meat in it? Should I, there's famous examples. Should I push one person onto a trolley track in order to save 5 people? Should I vote a certain way? Is it wrong to have an abortion in the first trimester? And it spits out the answer, Google does. It says, yes, no, yes, no. I'm not going to tell you which were which. So that seems actually like a good thing in many ways. I think it might even make for a better world if we had an app like that. But to me, it seems like there's something wrong with somebody who uses and relies upon an app like that overmuch. Now, one thing that's not wrong, and that's kind of delightful about it, is they're probably going to be right a lot more often. They're probably going to be better than I am at getting the right answer, assuming that Google is actually as reliable as Google Maps, for example. So that's a good thing. Well, what's wrong? Well, I don't know whether you share the sense, but I sense that there is something wrong. And so I want to kind of look and see what it is. And it's actually really hard to ask for a philosopher to get his ideas across in less than an hour and a half. But I'll try to do it in about 20 minutes. The problem, of course, generalizes. Google Morals is a way to sort of draw attention to a phenomenon that isn't really about apps and technology, although that makes it very vivid. It's about moral deference. It's about accepting somebody else's say-so with respect to a moral issue and taking that on board as your belief that you then proceed to act upon. That's what I mean by moral deference, and that's what strikes me as at least being suboptimal. It's something that oftentimes we must do, but it's not ideal. There's different kinds of deference, and philosophers love to make 1,000 distinctions. I'll try to stick to 3. One type of deference that would be reasonable, and it would be reasonable to ask an expert about, would be empirical issues that have to do with moral matters. So, for example, if you wanted to figure out whether or not it was right or not wrong to eat meat, one of the things you might want to know is whether or not animals felt pain. That's extremely relevant to that moral issue, but that itself is not a moral question. That's a question that you can ask scientists about, presumably, and they can figure out whether or not the sorts of systems that animals have are pain-feeling systems. That sort of deference doesn't strike me as particularly problematic. There's another way that I think we can defer to others that I think is also not terribly problematic, although has a little bit of a worry attached to it. And this is what I call derivative deference. This is a case where you might imagine somebody deferring to somebody who shares their basic values, but is better than they are at figuring out how those values sort of weigh out in particular situations. Right? So not all of us are as good at seeing how the various commitments that we have work with each other and set off one another in particular situations. So you can imagine somebody going to their priest, for example, and saying, well, I've got a situation where I don't want to lie because I think that lying is wrong, but at the same time, I want to respect my father and mother, so maybe there's some difficulty in making both of those work. And maybe the priest, having confronted many more examples of moral situations and thought about it more, is going to be good at advising you. I do think that there's something a little suboptimal about that, but in general, that seems to me to be not so bad because it's ultimately rooted in your own values that you already have, and somebody's just better at kind of seeing how they work out. And ideally, you'd get to the point where you could do that as well. The type of deference that I really have in mind that I think is the type that should worry us is what I might call foundational deference, where the acquisition of your initial values and feelings about moral situations comes by deferring to something like Google Morals. So for example, is lying wrong? I type into Google. Is it wrong to cause pain unnecessarily? Is it wrong to risk people's lives for small gains? These sorts of things that seems problematic even if you get the right answer, if you take on those beliefs. So what's wrong with it? Well, there's a lot of possibilities. I'm just going to mention two that I don't think work. One, of course, is that you might say, well, there is no Google Morals. That's the problem, is you're just kind of talking about a science fiction here. And so as philosophers do, you've confused us and you've made us think that there's a problem when there's not, when really it kind of lies in the idea that there is this application. Well, I actually don't think that's the problem, because what that only is saying in this context is that there's no such thing as moral experts, that there's nobody to defer to. And I personally doubt that. I don't think expertise requires perfection, right? Expertise in nothing requires perfection, right? But it seems like there are people that we all know, and we can point to them in our own lives, who we think actually have a great deal of moral expertise. And there certainly are lots of people who think that there are perhaps even infallible experts, right? The Pope, for example. And so even if we don't believe that, we still might want to figure out what's going on, what kind of bothers us about ideas about deferring to experts. And it seems like even if we knew that there were a perfect moral expert, we still would feel like there was something coming up short about deferring. The second thing that I think you might think is wrong with Google Morals, and somebody who acts on it, is getting closer, I think. And this is the idea that somebody, when they're acting on a verdict of Google Morals, isn't acting for the right reason. So an example is, I have students, unfortunately, who cheat. And most of them don't, though. But of the ones who don't, they really fall into two kinds. One type doesn't because they know I'm going to catch them. And they know that there's going to be severe consequences to pay, right? The other is the type of person who doesn't cheat because they know it's wrong to cheat. And they know that that sort of short-term benefit, even if they might get, even if they might get away with it, they know that that's not a legitimate, moral, ethical thing to do. The first group of people, I take it, are acting correctly, but they're not acting for the right reasons, right? They don't sort of get the full moral kudos because of the fact that their motivations are stemming from something else, in this case from self-interest, not from the reason that's wrong. So you might think that that's what's going on in Google Morals, is that when somebody's deferring to Google Morals, what they're doing is they're doing the right thing, but they're not actually doing it for the right reasons. Maybe they're doing it just because Google said so. I think that that could be the case in some instances. But as a matter of fact, I don't think that's the problem, because I think as a matter of fact, you can learn the truth about a matter from somebody and be acting on it because it's the truth, not be acting on it because it's what they said is the truth. So for example, you can imagine two people going to their priest and saying, is lying wrong? Priest says, yes, lying is wrong. They walk away. Jimmy says, you ask Jimmy, why are you not lying? His answer is, because the priest said that lying is wrong. You ask Jenny, why are you not lying? She says, because lying is wrong. You say, how'd you find that out? She said, the priest. That's a very different situation, right? She's doing it for the right reasons, that lying is wrong. She found out those right reasons by the priest. Jimmy, however, looks like he is doing it for the wrong reasons. He's doing it not because lying is wrong, but because the priest said lying is wrong, right? And you want to be able to get to the point where you're in touch with the actual moral reasons, and one way to do that is actually by somebody telling you things, and we do this all the time. So I don't think that that's the problem, but we're getting closer. I think that what Google Morals shows, or at least what your discomfort about Google Morals shows, is that we don't only care about right actions and good actions. We care about good actors, and we care about people not only being people who act correctly, but people being good people. And that's what we aim for ourselves, is not just being people who are sort of issuing forth good actions, even if they're doing it for the right reasons. But the problem with it is that something is lacking both in the way in which that action reflects our moral characters and in the way in which our moral characters get constructed in acting. So I actually think that the answer to the problem with Google Morals comes from one of our very first philosophers, Aristotle. His Nicomachean Ethics, I think, pretty much provides the reason why there's something problematic here. And that's because one of the things that we should care about, in fact, he thinks the thing we should care about most, perhaps, is we should care about being virtuous. And virtuous action and good action issues forth from virtuous agents, but what's important is that that action redounds to the character of the agent who is performing it. So I want to suggest that at least two problems here. One is that actions that are done simply, somebody who just checks Google Morals at every moral turn, those actions that are good may be done for the right reasons, but they don't redound to the character of the person who's acting because they don't issue from the character. The character is sort of bypassed. The second thing is that I think that the character who is doing this is actually not being sufficiently constructed. There's something you're not going to get from deferring in this case that we think is extremely important in moral construction and in the construction of moral character. Okay, so the answer, I think, is in moral character, but of course that's just a word at this point. What is moral character? Well, again, lots can be said about this, but following Aristotle, I think it should be tied to the idea of virtues. We can look at the idea of what it is to have a virtue and begin to kind of trace our way back to what it takes to have moral character. So let's take the example of generosity, let's say. What makes somebody generous? Well, a generous person, first of all, isn't just somebody who is reliably giving to others. That's good. That's getting there. But we can imagine several things that might actually make this person still not be a generous person, not have the virtue of generosity. If, for example, when she gives to others, she hates it. She finds herself absolutely regretting every penny that goes to this person instead of her and thinks about all the CDs, that's what I would think, all the CDs and records that she could buy that she's not able to buy. If that's what's happening every time she is generous, she's not really generous. She's acting generously, but she's not really a generous person. Aristotle thinks that in order to be virtuous, your feelings and your reactions have to be in line with the right thing to do. You not only have to do the right thing, you have to feel the right way about doing the right thing. And of course, that's not something that's necessarily going to come through deference to Google, right? Just because it says do blank isn't going to guarantee anything about my feeling a particular way about doing blank. In fact, it may very well be that it pains me immeasurably to be moral, and in that case, of course, I'm not virtuous at all. In addition to having the right actions and the right feelings, these sorts of things, according to Aristotle, have to stem in a certain way from the character of the individual. And it gets complicated, but the basic idea is that these virtues, things like generosity, need to be stable, persisting, reliable dispositions of the individual. And what I mean by that is that when you throw in new situations, they're going to retain the disposition. It's not the case that their generosity is going to depend upon them, let's say, making more than $1 million a year. If they make $40,000 a year, they're still going to be generous because their generosity isn't, it's a disposition that can survive changes in circumstance. That's what makes somebody generous, so that it actually isn't just a matter of luck that they have the means to be generous, or they're in the right sort of situations, or in the right sort of mood, or they're surrounded by the right sort of people. It has to be a virtue has to be something that sort of can be transported across various scenarios. So it's actually pretty hard to get that, and that's not something, that sort of reliability, that sort of across situation virtue is not going to be guaranteed by knowing any sort of factual belief about morality that's going to be issued from Google. According to Aristotle, it takes a lot of practice, and this is the sort of practice and habituation that we get in our early years, hopefully, when we're being reared as children. But, ideally continues, but he thinks a lot of it happens pretty early, and he's probably right about that. So that's part one of virtue that I think is missing. And it's sort of the feelings that might come with acting in a correct way, and also the stability and reliability of the disposition. But I actually think that there's something lacking still in somebody who has those characteristics. I think it's pretty good, but I think, so I hope that I don't offend anybody, but I don't really love Forrest Gump. And I think Forrest Gump has this level of virtue. And I think that's good, right? And that may be what Forrest Gump can get, but I think that we can do better than Gumpish virtue. I think that something is lacking. In particular, even if it is the case that he feels correctly, and even if it is the case he acts for the right reasons, and acts reliably for the right reasons, he doesn't understand fully the reasons for which he's acting. And what I mean by that isn't that he's not acting for the right reasons, it's that he doesn't understand, for example, the connection between various immoral actions. For example, what makes lying wrong? What is the connection between lying to somebody and respecting their autonomy? Is there a connection between the idea of, for example, of why democracy might be a good form of government and honesty might be a good character trait? These are the sorts of things that ideally you'd want to be able to reflect on. Because being able to reflect on those things gives you several advantages. Not just having the virtue of knowing what is the explanation is that underpins what is right or wrong, but also the flat ability to explain the reasons why you're doing what you're doing and explain why something is wrong is important for many reasons. One reason, obviously, is when you raise children or when you try to explain to somebody else why to do something, it's best if you can give them reasons and try to explain to them the sorts of reasons. But I also think that there's something to be said for the idea that we owe it to each other to be able to provide explanations that go beyond sort of lying is wrong, or democracy is a great form of government, or you shouldn't do something for profit if it harms a significant number of other people. We need to be able to explain enough to where we can sort of reach past preconceptions, reach past some of the differences that we might have in our particular value systems in order to communicate and justify what we're doing, and perhaps persuade one another to the other side. It's something that I think probably does underpin the idea of being a good citizen in a democracy, something we haven't seen exemplified a whole lot recently. So, but I think that probably even more important than the ability to explain, which is, something obviously philosophers would prize, but I think that what we particularly like about the idea of understanding the reasons behind our moral judgments and their connections is that it helps us apply our judgments to situations we hadn't anticipated. It helps us see how one particular moral judgment and the one particular answer from Google Morals might apply in another case. So, for example, lying is wrong. Well, what is Forrest Gump going to do when he's at the door in World War II and he's got Jews in his basement and the Nazi comes and says, "Do you have Jews in your basement?" Right? What does he do? I don't know what he does, right? And part of the reason I don't know what he does is because I don't have any confidence he's thought about that, right? I don't have any confidence that he understands that lying is wrong may not be like an end-all thing. It might have a lot to do with respect for persons, the same sort of respect for persons that's demonstrated by your refusal to let them be slaughtered, right? That understanding of the connection looks like it's a really important thing in guiding the action in a situation he never anticipated. And if I Google and it says it's okay to eat animals, it's kind of important that I understand that that doesn't give me license to eat my brother, right? That there might be reasons behind my not eating animals, by my being able to eat animals, which don't apply to other humans. So one thing that Google Morals isn't going to give you in addition to the feelings and in addition to the reliable ability to act in a way is the ability to anticipate and the ability to apply one's knowledge given new examples. And the fact is that we will never be able to get a full list of all the possible applications of the moral rules that we might encounter. When I first interviewed for this job, I met with Dennis Cordell, who recently passed away, and one of the things Dennis liked to say is he liked to say that our students don't know what job they're going to have because the job that they're going to have when they retire hasn't been invented yet. And this was one of Dennis's reasons. He was the Dean of General Education. This was one of Dennis's reasons for thinking that general education was important at SMU. And I think that there's a corollary to what Dennis said, which is that the moral dilemmas that you're going to confront probably haven't been invented yet. Right? We're entering a time of technological acceleration that is going to allow us to do things to ourselves and to each other that we haven't even imagined, involving modifications of our brains and other people's brains, our bodies. We're going to be able to face challenges to our democracy and challenges to our moral action that we really can't conceive yet. So it doesn't do to rely upon general rules and verdicts in order to provide our moral knowledge. We have to have a sort of moral understanding that is embedded in us in such a way that we understand the reasons that when we do come upon new cases, we can understand how our reasoning applies and how the old moral precepts can deal with these new sorts of situations. And so, while there is gumpish virtue, and that's a good thing, there's what Aristotle calls full virtue. And full virtue is going to require not only that you understand and be able to explain why you're doing what you're doing, but that you be able to apply it to new situations. And that looks like, to me, what we want to strive for, and that looks like something that's not going to be gotten by simple deferring to moral expertise. It's going to require more than that. So, if you agree with me about that there's basically a handful of things that we're missing when we look at Google Morals, namely, we're missing the things that make for good actors, I think this has a lot of implications for not only the way that we live our own lives as people trying to live morally, but it has a lot of implications for us as educators, I think. And I think that one of the things that I would like to take away from my feelings about Google Morals and where it comes up short is I've actually gotten a lot more enthusiastic about my job, because I actually think that a lot of what the humanities have to offer, actually, is this sort of education, is this sort of cultivation of character, this sort of understanding of the texture of humanity and the history of our heroism, but also our failures, and our understanding of the reasons why they're heroic and why they're sometimes failures, the ability to debate the principles upon which we're acting, and understand that when people disagree with us, we can sometimes actually get beneath that level of disagreement to interact with them and find that there are reasons that we actually share. These are the sorts of things that I think get done in the humanities, and actually I think get done in philosophy departments. And that in this age where I think there's a whole lot of bad news about the humanities and a whole lot of bad talk, I think it's really important to kind of remember Google Morals and kind of remember the sorts of things that it teaches us. And I think that one of the great things, like I said, about the McGuire Institute is that it provides the opportunity to allow us to get beneath the surface and begin to discuss these things. So I can't thank Mr. McGuire enough for starting it, but this is something that we each have to do and that we should continue to try to pursue at SMU. So, thanks.